Well, a lot of what we talked about already steals a little bit of the thunder, but in a good way, where everything's going to connect nicely here. So this talk is called Theology's Central Role in Classical Education. My fundamental question, because I've run into this in a school in Idaho that will remain nameless, in the place that I was, not what you're thinking of maybe, and also in a homeschooling organization that's widely known that will remain nameless, where there was some amount of drift happening already, and people wanting to know why that is. And I thought about this because I'd seen this phenomenon in a lot of parachurch institutions. And I think that's really at the heart of why there's all this drift. You see this attempt to have a classical and a Christian school together, and I think a lot of people sometimes are doing it on the cheap and not understanding why those two have to go together, actually, in some ways. But how do you call a Christian school Christian if it doesn't take a stand on, for example, who God is and what the gospel is? Because it's nice to have a metaphor like this and to say that theology has to be, say we're confessional, say all those different things, but you don't really have any content to that. And I think one of the reasons why we don't have content to that a lot of times is because of that parachurch phenomenon. We want to, I think oftentimes, break things down to the lowest common denominator because we're trying to reach out there for the biggest possible tent, whether it's to raise funds or to have people or just to have people to come and take interest. And what do? We water it down. And a lot of times you see that even when you talk about culture wars and things like that, is you spread everything so thin and you talk about having a worldview and you wind up gutting your worldview of the thing that's the most central. Why? Because it starts fights. We can't all agree on even who God is, even among evangelicals. And that's a problem when you demote that or when you minimize that. The real question is, what is education? What is it? And can that do without these most important things? Is it merely job training? We talked a little bit about that already. And certainly there's a place for actual trade schools, not this Frankenstein monster of trade schools that you were bringing up, intellectual trade schools. Well, the liberal arts were not designed to do that. I mean actual trade schools that would actually be helpful. You want an engineer to teach engineers and stuff like that, apprenticeship. That actually makes sense. So there is a place for that. However, that's not what we've tended to mean by a well-rounded education, a liberal arts education. Clearly, what everyone has in mind when they talk about well-rounded is a well-rounded soul, an actual person that the learning is supposedly trying to produce. In his classic book in 1987, Alan Bloom wrote a book called The Closing of the American Mind. And it's widely, and the guy's not a Christian. He was a secularist, but he said a lot of insightful things. And one of the things he said was this. Let me read this quote to you. He said, "Every educational system has a moral goal that it tries to attain and that informs its curriculum. It wants to produce a certain kind of human being. This intention is more or less explicit, more or less a result of reflection. But even the neutral subjects," and I think he means to put that, you'd put that in scare quotes today, because I think his point is that they're really not neutral. Even the neutral subjects like reading and writing and arithmetic take their place in a vision of the educated person. Then he says something really interesting. Always important is the political regime, which needs citizens who are in accord with its fundamental principle. Gives you examples. Aristocracies want gentlemen. Oligarchies, men who respect and pursue money. And democracies, lovers of equality. Now stop it. Why is he talking about this? Why is he talking about politics? Because these are the people that shape the educational system. So you have to deal with it one way or another. These are the people that are the method makers that are producing this. Democratic education, he says, whether it admits it or not, wants and needs to produce men and women who have the tastes, knowledge, and character supportive of a democratic regime, lowercase d, democratic. This education has evolved in the last half century from the education of democratic man to the education of the democratic personality. Now, what does he mean by that? He goes on to talk in those opening pages about an all-encompassing virtue which is openness. He made the observation that 18-year-olds come to his classroom year after year, and the only thing they care about, and the only thing they're expecting in books and to have produced in their mind is this virtue of openness, open-mindedness, in other words. That the problem in the world is the past, when people used to think they were right about everything. And so the goal is not to correct them and to really be right. The goal, these students think, culture has ingrained this in their mind, is to give up on the idea that there is any such thing as truth. So that's what he means by the democratic personality, in that sense, that any one truth is just as good as another and so forth. Now, before you allow your mind to drift into the deep end of the pool here for all the implications, just recognize that this principle of education that is founded upon a particular vision of human nature, a particular view of what human beings ought to be in society, that can either be more thoughtful or less thoughtful. And that is what shapes the schools. And what we're saying here is that as Christians, we should be the most thoughtful about that. Of course, the battle of regimes that Bloom mentions here should only be a slice of the pie. He's not arguing, and we're not arguing, that this should be driven toward a different kind of public policy, though that should certainly be part of it. What we're saying is that the Christian vision should never be less at any point than the secular vision. The Christian vision should encompass more things. It should create Christians that have a greater sense of vocation, should be out there in every single thing that people are doing in society should make more sense to the Christian than to the secularist. So what I want to show here are three things. So what does theology have to do with that is the million-dollar question here. Well, I have three answers for you, and not meant to be exhaustive, but when you're talking about a school at its foundational stage and why you should have an interest in this, this is where I'm going. So theology and worldview, that'll be the nerdiest subject, but we have to start there. And then secondly, theology and curriculum, and this is just going to follow from that. Once you see the place of theology in our thinking, well, of course, that's going to reflect in what books you choose and so forth. And then finally, theology and vocation. That'll just be a natural landing place. So let's talk about worldview for a second here. One author, Ronald Nash, gives a very helpful definition of worldview, and I give you a definition here. I know you all use the term worldview already, but this term and this idea is actually under attack, especially from people who are recovering classical thought nowadays. That's one of the ironies and one of the problems here, and I want to push back against them. So Nash says this, very helpful. In its simplest terms, a worldview is a set of beliefs about the most important issues in life. It is a conceptual scheme, so think of it as a circle or a set of ideas. A conceptual scheme by which we consciously or unconsciously place or fit everything we believe and by which we interpret and judge reality. So one of my first contentions here up front is that it is impossible to consider a school or a Christian way of doing anything, or to consider the role of theology in anything apart from the idea of worldview. To speak about a Christian way of doing this thing is to speak about a worldview. So here's the problem. And I've run into this, and I don't want to torture you with this too much in any obscure way, but you will come up against it, I think, in the years to come. The trouble is that all of the reclaiming of classical thought in recent years has brought with it the idea that the worldview concept comes to us, even the word itself is a German word. We now gave it the English word worldview because it's the best we could do with a lot of crazy German words. But it comes from Kant and Hegel and a lot of the early 19th century idealists. So what do? We're really good at throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so we say, well, I don't want to be guilty of that. Now, what were they guilty of? Nash called it a conceptual scheme. So here's you looking out at the world. There's a window. This is your brain. Remember those commercials? This is your brain on drugs. Well, this is your brain, and this is your brain on worldview. In fact, you can't really have any other kind of brain. As you look at the world, you look at it through the lens of what you've read and the conversations you've had, and so on. And so your worldview, back in view, your worldview, you can mean that in two different ways. You can mean that I am doing my best to conform my mind to the way the world is about everything. And I would suggest that's a good way to think about it. The other way you can mean worldview, think of the word for a second as I switch to the next slide. The other thing you could mean is that the world is coming into is what is in my mind. So now I'm not going to ask you to know too much about Kant or any of the guys that followed him at this point, but there was a criticism among those thinkers, and they kind of won out, unfortunately, of the old way of looking at things in terms of metaphysics or of being. The older thinkers before the Enlightenment would have seen the world as something that was really there, and God as really there. And so the goal of thinking and speaking was a very objective thing. It was to speak about the real world that was out there that we could all know about. We had this common field of vision that we had, and our job was to conform our minds to that. The subjective is supposed to conform itself to the objective way that things are. Kant especially put the last dagger in that old way of thinking. And so, if you want to look at a timeline, this one should actually be over here, the newer view. Idealist is named that because you're talking about a way of looking at the world where every single mind is its own circle. It's really, what's the definition of insanity? Give me a garden variety definition. Oh, that's one. Yeah, that is one. But that's the popular version of the definition of insanity. But let me give you an easy one. Insanity is losing your touch with the real world. It's to be out of touch with reality. This gave us what eventually became postmodernism and all of those anti-philosophies, as Francis Schaeffer called them, in the 20th century. So this is a very German idea, a very idealist idea, and there's all different versions of this in the 19th century, and what they all had in common was that in your mind you have these presuppositions. Of course, we agree with that. Presuppositions are these fundamental pieces of the puzzle that start to shape everything else. They're the things you believe about the biggest things: who God is, who you are, what kind of a world this is, and then how you fit as a rational being, or maybe as a purely material being, an evolved being, if you're coming from that school of thought. And so those presuppositions, those fundamental ideas, start to shape everything else. They're what point the camera the way that it is. And so everything becomes an extension of your mind and of your will. So that's kind of the world after Kant. Well, there's been a big recovery, not just in classical education, but if you've been in the seminary level, if you've been reading theology in the last 10 years, there's a very good, in my opinion, positive reclaiming of classical thinking in general about every subject, whether it's apologetics, theology, etc. They're doing good work, except here. They're making a mistake. They're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Luther said one time that human beings are a lot like a drunk that tries to get on a horse and they fall off on the other side, and then they try to get on the horse and they fall off on the other side. And in other words, we form our worldview, unfortunately, too often by reaction and by what I'm not going to be like my parents, I'm not going to do this, and so on. And you wind up doing that reactionary thing. And in these, it's called retrieval theology, in these classical circles that are retrieving all these old sources, which is all good, there's some throwing the baby out with the bathwater. They're throwing the worldview idea out. That's a German thing. That's a Kantian thing, and so forth. And they're throwing the idea. Now, why am I bringing this up? What do you lose? What do you lose if you lose the idea of worldview? You lose a coherent picture where everything really does go together. And there is a Christian way. There is a biblical way to see human nature. There is a biblical way to view politics and art and literature and so on. And these things are connected to each other. I did it again. I went off script because I have opinions about this stuff. There is an understandable and good and biblical reason why we want to be careful to not mean this. The Bible teaches general revelation. Psalm 19, Romans 1:20. And one of the results of general revelation, that God is speaking about himself in everything that he has made, is that you have something called common notions. In our discussion time, Ryan mentioned common grace. There are these ways that we come in contact with God's truth, whether we're studying science, whether we're doing literature, whether we're starting off conversation about Halloween. And it has a way, if you can do it right, if you can help people, that you can lead it all back to God. Why? Because it's all about God. Even the wrong ideas are distorted ideas about God. What this view did was to say that there's some central idea in the middle. And if you don't get that right, you're going to get everything else wrong. You're like, Well, that's true. If you don't get God right, you're going to get everything else wrong. What this view is saying is all or nothing right away. And this way of thinking tends to be suspicious of reading pagan books. What do you want to read? Plato even did this, by the way. I was thinking this, and I didn't want to barge in during the Halloween conversation. Plato even has a section in the Republic very suspicious of all of their poets. So even Plato was saying, well, maybe we shouldn't read the pagans. I know we're pagans, but maybe we shouldn't read the pagans because look at the gods. They're acting like a bunch of toddlers, and this is not virtuous, and you don't want to inculcate this in children and so on. So there is this idea that if you take this the wrong way, there's something at the center. We agree with that. Where we disagree is that you can't and that you shouldn't start where people start. Where do people start? With themselves, with senses. We'll see this in the discussion later when we talk about Aquinas and the 5 ways of showing God's existence. When Jesus talked to people, he met people on the road, he started where they were at. So there is, yes, everything does go together. Yes, there is a center. But if we really believe that, we'll be very comfortable studying the pagans. We'll be very comfortable studying literature. We'll be very comfortable starting where people are because we'll be able, as surely as we did in that Halloween conversation, we'll be able to take them from those particulars and we'll be able, I'm telling you right now, if we do it right, within 5 minutes or less, we'll be talking about God. And that's our job, and we can't do that unless we're comfortable enough in our own skin and comfortable with all the classics and reading all those different things. So, now I will skip past all of that because I said it in my own words. Here's basically the way this can work. And Francis Schaeffer, in a couple of his books, had this staircase model. And this applies to a lot of things. Schaeffer was showing the way that ideas move in particular minds. So you have a presupposition at the top of the stairs, and based on your view of the most real thing, that has effects on what you believe about something else that is consequent to that or contingent upon that reality, and so forth. Schaeffer wasn't just showing how things go in an individual mind with presuppositions. He was also showing how ideas move through culture, through time. If a culture embraces an idea of man being just a material object, well, then he will lose his value, as we alluded to in our conversation. And, why am I bringing it up here? Because it doesn't just apply to individual minds and whole cultures. It applies to your curriculum. It applies to school. It applies to how should you arrange things. Are there some subjects that are bigger than other subjects? Are there some subjects that go at the top of the stairs and other subjects that kind of go on a subsequent lower stair? And so this blue line represents water trickling down those stairs, because what you believe about God will entirely affect what you believe about man, which will immediately, in this case, in my example, affect how you believe what you do about sin, and so forth. So what I'm claiming here is that this has bearing on the relationship between intellectual disciplines. This strikes at the heart also of something that's very alive in the classical world, and it's a bit of a mistake, and that is that, in the classical world, I have this little picture. It's from something Dorothy Sayers related, and The Lost Tools of Learning. And so that's the side I got it from, and it's very small. Sorry about that. But creating the views of teaching her how to think, not simply what to think. Now, if you say it like that, amen. We want to teach people not just, in other words, we don't just want you to be robots that spit back things you're not thinking about what you're saying. And so I think we can all get on board and say we want to create self-learners. What does that mean? AI is a self-learner. That's not doing so hot in a lot of ways, right? So we don't just want to, you know that about the classical education is that you get to that's another problem, the whole stages, grammar, logic, rhetoric has stages. So that's sort of another problem. But in the popular conception, you get to rhetoric, and if all we've done is create people that are very articulate, well, you could be creating very articulate devils. You could be creating propagandists that are just really, really good at deceiving. What we're saying here is that in addition to that, but actually more fundamental to that, is it matters what you think. It matters. We are snobbish enough to say that there are better books than other books, that there are better ideas than other ideas, and that actually there's a hierarchy here. So if you lose that center of gravity, to use my solar system analogy, you as I said in that promo, you pluck the sun from that center, both the center of gravity and the source of light are lost. Students might perhaps gain efficiency in memorizing facts, being able to relate those facts, being able to articulate all of those things, but for all of that, you'd remain a disintegrated person and a disintegrated soul, vulnerable to any number of alternative narratives that don't have a proper center. You'd still remain ignorant as to what reality is, why everything goes together as it does. So that follows directly a right curriculum. Some of this is pragmatic. There's only a certain amount of time in the day. So in other words, the problem of what should I read individually, what should I read this year in my reading plan or whatever, that problem is just the same problem here that's just writ large on an institutional level. There's only so much time in the day, there's only so many years in your life, there's only so many seasons in your life that are specifically set aside to open up those books and to have, so when somebody says to me, well, great books, who gets to decide what the great books are? First of all, that's disingenuous. The people that are talking about, you ever hear this? Decolonization of the canon. They want to, at certain universities, take out Shakespeare, take out all these different things. Don't even read about George Washington anymore in history. In order to make things more equitable, what's the problem with that? History wasn't equitable. I mean, let's just take history. Part of the point of history is not to take sides or to replay and you go back in time. You can't do any of that. The goal of history is to learn from history about virtues and so forth and so on. So you're already dealing with an anti-reality. But here's the other reason it's disingenuous. When you decolonize the canon, you're recolonizing it with something else. So you're not replacing a great books with ungreat. You are simply selecting a new great according to you and according to some egalitarian standard, whatever it is. And so let's just be honest here. Now, the other thing that follows from this is let's be proactive. In another pretty good book, this book is called The Idea of a Christian College, Arthur Holmes speaks of the unique role of the Christian liberal arts college as not merely, and he uses a phrase here, he says, not merely as an interaction of faith and learning, but more specifically an integration of faith and learning. Now I have a picture here that could be guilty of oversimplification, also very small. But what I'm meaning to say here, you have God in the center here and you have all these subjects on the outside, so the specifics don't matter as much. What we're saying here is that they don't just happen to be there, and then we're slapping this in the middle because, again, we're Christians and we want to appeal to people's Christianity and convince them that we're confessional, so we're going to put God there in this picture. But if you ask me, how do these things actually, does this really matter, or does Reformed theology or classical theology or these particular attributes of God, does that really affect how I read literature, or does that really affect anything else? What we're saying here in this picture is they're not just interacting, they are integrated. But that assumes that there's a proper order. That assumes, again, that staircase model. That these things are actually, in some ways, a function of theology. There's so many verses I can share with you from Scripture that talk about all things being created by God and for God and about God. Many verses come to my mind as I think about that. But that's literally the truth. That's not just something we slap on our bumper sticker to appear more spiritual. These things are actually things that were created by God to speak about God. In specific ways, though. Okay, so part of the fear here, I think, a little balance here, is somewhere along the line in the 19th and 20th century, and too many Christians bought into it, is that religion is very different from thinking. That's really what they meant. It's really different from philosophy, really different from science, where you have free inquiry. And so they had this very distorted idea of academic freedom and academic independence of the institution from the community, from the confession. We won't be thinking, really, if we have everything be about God, because then everything is going to be what you're saying here, not you yet. What you're saying here is that everything is theology. If I buy into that, well, that would be the opposite extreme. So we're not saying that these things do not have their own methods. You're not going to feel like theology is breathing over your shoulder, and so therefore I can't do the scientific method. Therefore, I can't talk about literary genre or whatever else. That's not the case at all. In fact, in that other picture, as I'll just skip ahead to that, I mean, and you can use countless examples of this. All the founders of the scientific revolution, all Bible-believing Christians. You know, you had someone like Isaac Newton say that the purpose of the scientist is to think God's thoughts after him. And this guy Maxwell, he's somebody as late as the 19th century, and even I can give examples as late as the 20th century. And I think you're going to see this come back as more and more of the old system of the understanding of scientism in the 19th century is really hollow. Well, Maxwell was a Bible-believing Christian, and he was responsible in unveiling so much of the relationships between optics and magnetism and electricity. And he has on the door of his classroom posted Psalm 111:2. Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them. Well, that means exactly what it says. The works of the Lord are the things we study in science and history, and yes, even politics and things like that. And so Maxwell wrote in a letter, Christianity, that is the religion of the Bible, is the only scheme or form of belief which disavows any possessions on such a tenure. And there's a context to this. He was already talking about free academic inquiry and stuff like that. Here alone, all is free. You may fly to the ends of the world and find no God but the author of salvation. You may search the scriptures and not find a text to stop you in your explorations. It's one way to say that the God of Scripture is the God of nature. It doesn't mean other people can't get that wrong, but we don't fix that by retreating from nature or by retreating into Scripture, because that does a dishonor to Scripture and ultimately to God. All truth is God's truth, as we said earlier. So contemplating the study of history is a good place to show this. I mean, if you remove God as the first and final cause of history, go back to that. I have history on there somewhere. If you remove God as the first cause of history and the final cause, the end cause, the reason that God in his providence is driving everything to, think of the fullness of time in Galatians 4:4. If you remove God from that idea of history, what do you have? I mean, I think we can see that history is personal. It's if you take personhood out of history, you don't have history. You're left with something like what the Marxists call material analysis. Even if you don't call it that, you've reduced the human soul to that. It's obvious in things like psychology as well. But you also lose a sense that history is going somewhere, that God's judgments are being handed out. You say, well, see, this is what I don't want to study that in history because I'm studying theology. And that's the battle, is that you don't lose the historical method when you do. In fact, history without God becomes cyclical, becomes meaningless. If you go outside of a Christian theistic context, when they do talk about history at all, it's cyclical in the Greek ancient worldview, or it's completely meaningless. And you delve into this sort of cynicism about past heroes. You get statues torn down. You get things, virtue, anybody in history that ever did anything, well, no, they were all bad all the time. And even that can appeal to our Calvinistic sense of total depravity, but that's not what the person's doing. He's debunking virtue now. He's what Lewis said, men without chests. He's creating men without chests now, and he's doing it by a proxy war of debunking all these heroes in history. And we can fall for that if we're not careful. But if you lose a God who both removes kings and sets up kings, Daniel 2 says, and who calls on us to do justice, as Micah 6:8 says, you lose providence, well, then you lose fighting for justice altogether. And I submit that that's what the history debunkers are up to. Now, you can ask this question about other things. What's the purpose of learning Greek? What's the purpose of learning Latin? And we'll be told that it brings us directly to the minds of the great tradition. And again, you get that cynical response. Why do I care about the great minds, as you call them, of that tradition? Well, at this point, you're not just saying, well, this is my gateway to read Cicero, or even Christian authors like Athanasius or Dante. We have to get to a point where we actually have to justify that way of thinking, that we actually have to say, well, it's actually, I'm going to go out on a limb here and claim that they were more right than we were. Plato and Aristotle oftentimes get God more right than anti-intellectual Christians do. And we do run into that in many ways. And you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? For 20 centuries, Christians didn't make those mistakes. Okay, so we want to say that there's actually a superior outlook to the world. I'm skipping a lot of material as I go, so I can be more conversational here. But that brings us at least then to our last point, theology and vocation. I hear Christians complaining about this all the time. Well, I hear everybody complaining about this. There's no moral actors anymore. It's not just there's no heroes anymore. We're past that. There's not even any moral actors. You can't stand up on a train and defend somebody that's being picked on anymore because you'll go to jail. Why is that? Well, there's different answers that commentators can give you today, but behind that, there's a moral problem. We lament that there's no moral actors on the stage of culture, but then we retreat from the very institutions that are designed to produce leaders in those areas. And this is where I'm going to sound a little elitist. I'm going to say that it actually matters that we produce Christian men and women who can't not just think about it in private, but actually become leaders of people in their local communities and even maybe in the public square. One of the major offenders here, you ever hear the word manosphere? Manosphere. So it started with Jordan Peterson, I guess. But there's all these people, just regular people. You know, this guy Mike Rowe on Fox, he'll go on Fox and he'll play up the trade schools as a means, and again, I'm for trade schools. But the idea is that there is now this Christian and conservative argument to leave the university behind. And the same people are very politically involved. Same people are making all these criticisms about morality and culture. But you're missing the problem. You're blaming the wrong things when you blame the idea of people coming together and studying and thinking. When we do send our students to Christian colleges or to seminary, whether we like it or not, we're more often than not sending them to either factories of heresy or where they have people that are orthodox teaching and can be good biblical theologians and systematic theologians. You're often handing them to people that have really next to no background in apologetics and ethics. So you've got the good stuff in here in your Christian doctrine, but you've handed them to people who are functionally postmodern or progressives or pietists. There's a lot of P words, but handing them over to people that have sort of checked their brain at the door when it comes to thinking about how you think about the world the other 6 days a week. And so we need institutions that actually teach all of those things and do so from a Christian perspective. And here's what students do to themselves. When we're looking at the road ahead, and we're looking at that time in college, and we're making our decisions based on it, and you hear this even in people that are mulling over classical education versus others, when they're weighing and we all do this, we all have a pragmatist on our shoulder that's telling, well, yeah, but how's that going to pay the bills? But how's that going to work for this or for that? Your time in college should be a time of deep intellectual and spiritual growth. I put those together because I think we do intellectual growth, but spiritual growth. Well, that's what that is. That your soul is a thinking thing. Increasingly, the mindset is to settle into the degree that will guarantee a steady paycheck in the end, and we're all for steady paychecks. But consequently, the student has to forego paying much attention to exactly those ideas that will shape their souls. It'll even cause them to ignore those studies to which they're most drawn. The fact of the matter is, you have interests in these questions, especially if you've been in a classical Christian or homeschooling context. You already have built into your soul an interest in these things, and now you're going to repress that. But who do you think gave you those interests? Might those ideas and those interests have something to do with your purpose in life? Do you honestly think that God, who calls you, would also give you these set of intense interests in thinking that are totally at cross purposes with your vocation? Think about what vocation is for a second here. People, vocation day, or all these orientation things, and they use that word. They have no earthly idea what this word implies. I mentioned this about psychology. We got this whole science dedicated to this, study this thing that the people that are studying it don't believe in. Psyche, Greek, that means the soul. Well, what does vocation mean? Vocare means to call. Who's calling? So as Christians, we understand that this very idea comes from God. So I have this guy, Torn. He's there at orientation day. He's thinking through this. And I could have picked anything, but I think that makes the point. The Christian God makes sense of having a meaning and purpose in life. Other so-called gods do not. They say, well, okay, well, I'm not a pagan, so I don't believe in other so-called gods. But all of the things, there's a God. There's a false God. Security, what all the other institutions are doing, how am I going to pay for this, etc. These become idols for us. Just as the biblical worldview makes science intelligible, history intelligible, by all the ways that it does that, a sovereign God makes intelligible this decision. I just have a couple verses down there that in various ways teach us that God is behind even infusing us with all of the habits that we've worked on through our classical education so far, and all the interests and the way that we ask questions and so forth. As his image bearers, he makes what we do change things. Think of the evangelist in Romans 10. Think about all the good works that are ordained for us in Ephesians 2:10, or whatever we put our hands to do, doing it with all our might in Ecclesiastes 9:10. So objectively, God-ordained vocation implies that all these other things, the supposedly mundane and secular things, are in a very real sense sacred things. And it doesn't blur the distinction between those things. There's another New England Puritan, Thomas Shepard. I have the quote on maybe I'll just go there now. On the last slide, Thomas Shepard, he's writing a letter to his son who's going off to college. This is in Puritan New England. So you've all this whole landmass and future ahead of not just you, but you're someone who's going to, in some way, be a part of the foundation of this new nation, this new kingdom. And of all the advice he could give to him about the material wealth and all the different things to think about the immediate future, he says this: remember the end of your life, which is coming back again to God and fellowship with him. Now, this fits very well with another admonition from Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiastes 12:1. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth. So what Shepard is saying here to his son is live like this now, and do it especially now. It doesn't get easier. Reading time doesn't get easier as you get older. You might not know that. But it doesn't get easier. Do it now. Finding friends who even talk about these things. Talk to your parents and they'll tell you the tales of, I think I'm crazy. I can't even find 2-3 people. If you're in a local church that you can do this, great. But for a lot of people, it does not get easier. So if theology is, and this is one of the sort of the sub-definitions that Aquinas gave to theology, it's very Romans 11:36. For all things are from him and through him and to him. To God be glory. So Aquinas gives this sort of sub-discipline or definition of theology, that all theology is taught by God, through God, about God, or gives glory to God. So you'd say that it's from God and of God and back to God. If that's true, then it's precisely this real world, all these other little planets stand for all those other things, history, science, whatever, even the trade schools, whatever else, these things that we're called to, these spheres, it's precisely this real world call that has to be sketched out and colored by your vision of God. I think, and I'll close with this, I think of the imagery. I used the word transformed in the video. We used synonymous words throughout the day already so far. There's that picture of Isaiah in Isaiah 6, where he comes into the throne room of God, and he has this vision of God. And what does he say as a result of seeing God? Woe is me, for I am lost, and I am a man of unclean lips. I dwell among a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. And then almost in the next breath, what happens after he was cleansed? Vocation. Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then I said, here I am, or here am I, send me. That's the call, in essence. Now, it's very dramatic in that particular biblical account, but it comes from transformation of the person. That's what it comes from. That's vocation not on the cheap. That's real vocation. It takes seeing God in order to hear from him. I remember a story Michael Allen, one of my professors at RTS in Orlando, he told this story of one of the first days of class. He was telling the story of a young man who was taking up, I don't even remember the subject, but he was getting lower grades than he thought he should get from a particular professor. And on the last day of class, the students are all coming up to the professor, receiving their grades back from him, some final paper, whatever it is. This particular student received a grade that was well below, again, what he was expecting. So he thought a little bit more highly of himself than he thought he should. But he protested. He waited for everybody else to leave, and he looks at the professor and says, "What do I have to do to get an A in this class?" And he says, "Become a deeper person." And that cut to him, and I don't know what became of this student. I don't know if that changed him at all, or if he became hardened and didn't get the message. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that if you simply read more Plato or have better conversations with better classical people, that that's in any way analogous to Isaiah's experience in coming into the throne room of God. But I also can't help but wonder if so much of our directionlessness, and I'm speaking specifically of college prospective students, is to be laid at the feet of we Christians who've removed what's highest from supposedly higher education. C.S. Lewis said in his masterpiece on education, "We produce men without chests. We remove the organ and demand the function." And so it is with us. So to translate that into my imagery, here we remove the sun and we expect to be called to one of these orbiting planets around it. So I would say if you're a student without a path, or if you're a student just like that person torn, thinking about a path, don't be so quick to pay the professional path setters who don't even believe that there's a destination. They don't believe that there's an ultimate thing or voice who has called you. Instead, become a deeper person. You'll find out soon enough whether or not you've been called once you've been changed. So think about those things, and I will open it up to questions or comments or anything else.